I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll analyse the Ukrainian counter-offensive around Kharkiv, scrutinise the ongoing battle for Snake Island, and discuss what one expert believes are the three major strategic errors committed by Vladimir Putin.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 11th of May, day 77. And today, I'm joined by Nicholls, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Assistant Foreign Editor Venetia Rainey, and Assistant Comment Editor Dearnley. I started by asking Dom and Venetia for the latest updates from the war.
Hi David, hi everybody. The most important update I would suggest is the news from Kharkiv up in the northeast of Ukraine. This is Ukraine's second city, the city from which the pictures came in very early in the early hours of the war, really, of Russia's assault. It's been under bombardment since the war started. As we've been reporting in the last few days, Russian forces have been pushed back. It's not a straight line, clearly, the front line around there, but they're looking to be about 50 kilometres, so 30 miles north and east of the city, and that is significant because that's kind of on the range of the vast majority of artillery systems they've got there. So it pushes the city, or pushes the forces threatening the city away, allows the population to breathe a little bit easier. I mean, President Zelensky last night in his nightly news address, correctly, I guess, described this as good news. But the governor of the region, Oleg Sinabukov, said that Russia had left behind, quote, deadly traps. And he was at pains to impress upon civilians not to rush back to their homes for fear of, as we've seen elsewhere in the country, fear of areas being mined and booby-trapped and what have you. And of course, regardless of mines and booby traps and other things, other ordnance that may have been left behind, many of the structures are just simply unsound. So good news from Kharkiv. It pushes. There are unconfirmed reports that the Russian forces in the area have been pushed as far back as the border. I mean, the border is only 15, well, depending which bit you draw it from, but it's very, very close to the portion of the border there. And there's Belgorod, the main logistic hub inside Russia, about a further 100 k's. So it's fairly easy, I guess, for Russia to fall back on what will soon become internal lines. So falling back to a safe place. Unlikely they will be surrounded, as we saw in around Kyiv when they were pushed back from there. But it's still a significant effort. Very significant effort from Ukrainian forces to knit together these local counterattacks into a larger operational event, if you like. They may well now pause because that would have taken quite something out of them, but that might then, if they are able to keep a toehold there, hang on to Kharkiv and the surrounding area, then that could act as a sort of springboard to really threaten the supply lines down to Russia in the Donbass. I'll just take a pause there.
Yeah, I think another story that's on our radar is what's happening in Kherson. Our listeners will remember Kherson was one of the first Ukrainian cities to be taken down in the south of the country. And we've heard today from the leader of the Donetsk that the city plans to ask Moscow to annex it. They're going to skip the referendum that we'd heard so much about it and that Zelensky had decried as a sham. And they're just going to go directly to Putin and ask him to sign a decree telling him to annex it. This would obviously be really significant if it's formally annexed in the same way that Crimea was. That's another chunk of territory that Ukraine will have to fight very hard to get back. Russia's gains in the south seem a lot more solid than what we've been seeing in the east. As Dom was just talking about, they've been pushing back around Kharkiv. But Kherson, despite we have seen a lot of protests, we've seen, a lot of pushback from residents there, but it is clearly under Russian control. They brought in the Russian ruble, they've been raising Russian flags. And now this news that they're going to ask to be formally annexed.
Can we talk a little bit about the fighting that's continuing on Snake Island? Dom and Venetia, what's happening there and why does it matter?
So Snake Island, a very small lump of rock in the northwest of the Black Sea, a few kilometres off the coast of Ukraine, to the southwest of Odessa. Excuse me. Sorry. So famous for the opening salvo in the war when the Moskva was told to get lost by the Ukrainian defenders. It was then overtaken by Russian forces and is now notionally, I guess, in Russian hands. Now, in and of itself, it is not vital to Russia's interest in the region. So they could launch an amphibious assault against Odessa or anywhere else in the south coast of Ukraine could be launched without needing to hold Snake Island. However, if Snake Island is held by the Ukrainians, any amphibious assault, any threat to Odessa or to the coast along there, and of course there have been these claims from Russia that they're still interested in Transnistria, in Moldova. So any threat to that area it becomes much, much harder to achieve if Ukraine hold Snake Island. So it's been fought over repeatedly in the last few days. Much more effort has gone into that from Ukraine since the sinking of the Moskva. So the Moskva was providing, it had a number of roles, but it was essentially providing air defence, and a big air defence umbrella underneath which other operations could take place. So without that air defence protection, the Russian forces on Snake Island are quite vulnerable. Any vessels seeking to resupply it are very vulnerable, and any airborne elements, helicopters trying to land people, are incredibly vulnerable as well. So it's been fought over. There's been a number of there's some footage on social media taken by drone, we imagine, of Ukrainian air activity bombing Snake Island, and just the other day there was a report, there was imagery of a helicopter landing, troops coming out of the helicopter in a tactical formation to effect some activity on the island. Now, it was originally suggested this was Russian forces seeking to reinforce the island, and the helicopter was destroyed. We don't know how many casualties there were, but judging by the blast we saw on social media, it would have been very significant. Then it was suggested that no, they wouldn't be Russians because Russia owns the island, so they have no need to effect a sort of tactical assault. This must be a Ukrainian helicopter that was destroyed. We now think it actually is the first version. It is a Russian force. If the forces on Snake Island had been so degraded such that they were, for example, out of communications with their parent headquarters, then it would make absolute sense that any Russian reinforcements going to the island would treat everything as hostile until proved otherwise. So the helicopter we saw, that was an Mi-8 transport helicopter. Mi-8, you can tell because the tail rotor is on the starboard side. Mi-17, the derivative of the Mi-8, obviously has the tail rotor on the port side. But this reinforcement did not work. It was filmed by we think a TB2 Bayraktar drone, and we think probably subject to the munition fired from either that drone or another one. And that report has been backed up by messaging on the Telegram social media channel by the Wagner Group. Wagner Group being the mercenary group under the direction of the Russian state. So it looks as if firstly that attack was a Russian reinforcement that was destroyed. There's significant fighting over the island. If Ukraine can manage to hold it and then put air defence assets on it and anti-sea capabilities, including the British Brimstone missiles that are being sent out, then that will be very significant. The Brimstone missiles that are going out from Britain are the land-based variant. However, it doesn't take a huge amount of adaptation to change them into the seaborne variant. So if Ukraine are able to retake and hold Snake Island, put air defence assets on it and anti-maritime assets, anti-sea assets, then that will be very, very significant. The British Defence Intelligence daily intelligence assessment for today draws light to this. You'll find that on social media. Have a look at that. But essentially they're saying that if Ukraine are able to hold and reinforce, then it will deny the northwest portion of the Black Sea to Russia. And of course they need the northwest portion if they're going to have any kind of seaborne invasion amphibious assault towards Odessa or further west. So Snake Island, it's a tiny little pimple of rock, but it will have operational and possibly even strategic importance.
Thanks, Dom. Let's move away from Ukraine momentarily, go to Sweden. Boris Johnson is in Sweden. What has he announced? It sounds extremely significant. Venetia and Francis.
Yeah, so he has announced a major new security pact, basically, with both Sweden and Finland, where he'll be visiting after he's going to Finland after he's in Sweden. And it's essentially to reinforce their security and fortify Northern Europe's defences. The idea, it's a bit light on specifics, what we know so far. But I think the idea is basically that UK is offering some form of guarantees as Sweden and Finland prepare to join NATO. We've known this was coming for a while. It's a huge change in the Nordics. This was not seen as like a popular policy or anything like a goer a couple of months ago, but the Russian invasion has changed all of that. We are expecting them to formally announce their bid for NATO membership in the coming days, possibly tomorrow by the Finnish Finnish President. But that will leave them exposed during the time between when they announce that they want to apply and when they formally become members and Article 5 ticks in, and they will have the backing of all NATO fellow countries. So this presumably is some kind of agreement to paper over that time and also to start to build ties with these countries beyond what already exists. Finland already hosts NATO troops for training, so there's a lot of cooperation there already. But this is the beginning of an even stronger security pact relationship that we're seeing.
If I could just jump in there and say that, just to reiterate what Venetia was saying, that this is a very, very significant moment. We've spoken previously on this podcast about the Finnish War of 1939, when the Finns went to war against the Soviets after a Soviet invasion. So they have a long history of contesting territory with the Russian state. And but as Venetia was saying, for really a whole generation after the Second World War, they were quite hesitant to engage too closely with the Western powers, particularly NATO, for fear of essentially poking the Russian bear and potentially leading to severe military consequences. There has been a generational shift, I think, that is not just triggered by Putin's invasion, but also people have the younger generations in both of these countries have started to be more sympathetic to the idea of more closely aligning with the military alliances within Europe and with Europe more generally. And I think it is significant that particularly the Finnish Prime Minister, but to some extent the Swedish Prime Minister as well, represent this generational shift. The Finnish Prime Minister is, I think, in her 30s, and it just speaks to something else that's going on beneath the surface in both of these places. Just one other point as well I would just add is that, as Venetia was saying, the intention of Vladimir Putin from the very beginning of this war was to sow division in the West and within the NATO alliance about how best to react to Russian aggression. And clearly, this is the biggest indicator I think we have yet of just the extent to which that policy has fundamentally failed, because NATO has effectively now expanded another 1,000 miles. And if that doesn't register as a failure on Putin's radar, then I don't know what will.
Thanks, Francis. Can we talk a little bit about what's happening in Ukraine? Ukraine said today it's prepared to suspend the flow of some Russian gas to Europe. What's happening there, and what might be the impact of that?
Yes, well, as you say, this is another interesting development in the war. So we've talked already about how there's the military front, there's the diplomatic front, and of course there's also the economic front that is currently being fought. So as you say, Ukraine are preparing to suspend the flow of Russian gas to Europe through one of the key transit zones. Obviously, this is in part trying to cut off sources of the Russian state to receive financial support through the back door from other nations in Europe. But more significantly than that, actually, I think this is sending a clear signal to Germany. This is one of the major transit points for the Germans to receive around 30% of their gas, I believe. And so this is, again, I think a signal to them that they are not going to continue to allow Germany to be financing Russia in their desire to cheap buy and purchase their Russian energy. Just to speak to this ongoing, I suppose, economic issue at the forefront of the current crisis. It was interesting remarks made, I believe it was yesterday, by the boss of Volkswagen, who called for the EU to pursue a negotiated settlement to the war in the Ukraine for the sake of the continent's economy. Now, of course, Volkswagen, one of the major German companies, one of the major industries in Germany, of course, is car manufacture. And the fact that such a significant figure can make these proclamations, I think speaks to the mentality that's present in many of the amongst the German elite that we've commented on several times about the war in Ukraine. And I think that there is a real disconnect between German foreign policy and economic policy, and that it's being felt not only within Europe, but also within Germany. I think the German population have moved far more quickly than Olaf Scholz and the German government have. And whilst they have been, of course, forced in recent weeks to provide more heavy military support, as we've said many, many times, until Germany are willing to completely wean themselves off both Russian oil and gas, not just oil, not just gas, but both, and thus far they've only made a real progress on the former, then this war is likely to continue for much longer, just given the scale of the financial support that state is offering Russia. So it's a real key battlefront in this conflict, and one that at the moment we're seeing both sides are engaging in the diplomatic spat over that. As I say, Ukraine's foreign minister has actually condemned the remarks of the Volkswagen chief. So yeah, significant progress on that this week.
Thanks, Francis. Anything to add to that, Venetia and Dom?
Well, just one point I should have mentioned there when we were discussing Finland is just to note that if Finland applies and is accepted for NATO membership, that will double the length of the NATO border with Russia. So at the moment it's about 1,300 kilometres, and with Finland that will double to 2,600 kilometres. Now, I mean, that's not massive. I mean, it's only notable because Vladimir Putin keeps going on about being surrounded by NATO, and at the moment I think it's about 4 or 5% of his border is with NATO. So that, hey, that's going to double to, let's say, 10 or 11%. It's not going to be massive, but there will be a reaction framed around NATO encirclement. So yeah, should expect that. And just one final point: when I was with Ben Wallace last week in Finland, and we were talking about this possibility of Sweden and Finland applying, and this sort of security gap, is there going to be a security void between applying and being accepted? Because of course all 30 members have to say yes. Is there going to be a security void there before they're covered by the all-important Article 5? And Ben Wallace said no. And we reported at the time this is not sort of breaking state secrets. But he said, look, effectively, the security guarantee is going to be there. We've got very close military, economic, and diplomatic ties already with Sweden and Finland. That, of course, we would come to their aid if there was any attack in the meantime. But when he turned to the possibility of a Russian attack with Finland, he just said, well, with what? I mean, there's not an awful lot left in the locker, so it's largely a moot point. But yes, the security guarantee would be. Of course, it's only the British Defence Minister saying this, but for UK's part, the security guarantee would be extended from the moment they applied.
Thanks, Dom. Venetia, would you like to comment on this? There's another story here that the leader of the Russian activist band Pussy Riot has managed to flee Moscow to evade time in a penal colony. This is after criticising Putin's war in Ukraine. How did she manage to get out?
Yeah, this is a great story. So she disguised herself as a food courier, and there are pictures online of her in a sort of bright green jacket with one of those square delivery rucksacks that we all know all too well. Apparently she fled. She managed to get to the Russian border. She was driven there by a friend. And then she managed to secure some European identity documents and then was escorted across Belarus into Lithuania. So she had to sort of go via Belarus as well. And everything was sort of highly secretive. And apparently she even fled wearing black 3-inch heels without the laces, which is a reference to the fact that she's been in prison a lot under the Russian regime, and in prison you're not allowed your shoelaces. She's a real activist figure. She's been very outspoken. Pussy Riot, obviously best known perhaps for exposing their breasts at Putin, writing messages, activist messages on their chests. But they've long been critical of Putin's regime and have long been punished for it. But clearly they've decided that the time has come, that it's not enough for them or for that activism to stay in Russia and keep being periodically jailed, or perhaps they thought that this jail stint wouldn't be so periodic. And most of Pussy Riot, I believe, have now left. She was the leader, and they're now going to be doing a tour around Europe, starting in Berlin tomorrow.
Thanks, Venetia. I mean, that does seem to speak to the point. I remember Natalia Vasilyeva, our Moscow correspondent, came on here a couple of weeks ago, and we asked her about Russian opposition, and she said, well, you know, what opposition? Most people have left or they're in prison. And that goes to, I think, some of the other things we've said about if the war goes worse for Putin, what might happen? And the answer might just be nothing, because he controls all the levers of state, and there isn't an obvious opposition figure to him. Francis, does that sound accurate to you or not?
Yes, well, I think that does sound accurate. Unfortunately, we've spoken, as I say, many times on this podcast about the particular case of Russia and the vast numbers of people who have left the country, several 100,000 now. I think it may even be as many as 500,000 young people who have left as a consequence of essentially Putin's leadership, and obviously that's particularly heightened in recent months following the invasion of Ukraine. These are young people who are educated and the sort of, I suppose, what we would articulate as the middle class, who working in industries that essentially every good economy needs, sort of particularly a military one that's building a lot of highly advanced weaponry and technology. You need sort of highly educated scientists and things like that. But they are not just leaving, but they are being encouraged to leave by Vladimir Putin for the simple reason that he sees that anyone who is wobbling over their loyalty to the Russian state, he would rather leave. Now, the challenge of this is, of course, that when you don't have that core opposition in a country that is ready to assume power or challenge power, then it means it is far less likely for there to be some sort of revolution or coup or democratic spring whatsoever. You know, this is something that is going to be, I think, a real challenge for the West longer term. Is I don't see in the short term necessarily there being any coup against Putin would have to come from within his own regime. But of course, his own regime are complicit in the crimes that have been committed in Ukraine. So it is not necessarily in their interests to try and oust him, because they would, you know, face destabilizing the state and face themselves being under the spotlight. So it's a very, very complicated picture. And I think, as I've said many times, you know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of people who were waiting in the wings who could fill in the spaces in the Czech Republic and other places. That won't be the case in Russia, and so I don't think we should hold out hope that any sort of coup or uprising is in the offing in the short term.
Thanks, Francis. Just one more update I think we should talk about. David Beasley, the Executive Director for the UN World Food Programme, has said that Ukraine is facing agricultural collapse unless its ports in Odessa are opened soon. Venetia, do you have more to say on this?
Yeah, so we've been covering a lot the food security aspect of this war, both for people in Ukraine and for people around the world, particularly in North Africa and the Middle East, who depend on Ukraine's exports of things like corn and sunflower oil for very basic foodstuffs. And a lot of the products have been stuck in Ukraine because they just can't get out. And this speaks to the blockade in the Black Sea that we've been talking about to do with Snake Island. The port in Odessa, which is where the vast majority of Ukraine exported its grains and other things, that has not been functioning since the beginning of the war. It's been completely blockaded. So there's a lot of stuff backed up, and this stuff can't get out anywhere. WFP have been warning that, Ukraine can't handle keeping this stuff back anymore. The farmers also haven't been able to plant their harvest. The land is heavily mined. A lot of equipment has been sabotaged. The EU has also been looking at this issue, trying to figure out a way to help. The land border is just very, very slow, but they're now trying to see if they can create some kind of fast track system to get it to Poland's Baltic ports and then export grains by sea to the various countries around the world where they need to go. But it's a massive issue, and one that will continue to be in the spotlight and is sort of rumbling in the background as more and more countries suffer food security issues. There's a cost of living crisis in a lot of places in the world right now being caused by the Ukraine war to do with fuel and food prices. One to keep an eye on.
Thanks very much, Venetia. Thank you so much for your time. Francis, I know you've been working with editing Phillips OBrien, who's writing us for today about what he sees as the three major strategic mistakes Putin has made in this conflict. Can you talk a bit about what his argument is? What are the big mistakes from Putin?
Yes, well, it should be live either, if it's not already, very shortly, imminently. So Phillips OBrien of St Andrews University, we've commissioned many pieces from him, and I'm sure he's very vocal on Twitter, so many of our listeners will also be familiar with his fantastic analysis throughout the conflict. Yes, he's writing a piece for us about why essentially Putin has failed in the Donbass and what his three big miscalculations were. And some of them echo things that we've, of course, commented on this podcast throughout. So it's quite a good summary piece for anybody who's trying to catch up on where we are as we begin this new week in Ukraine. But essentially, the three miscalculations that he defines are the significant number of forces in the Donbass that are not really militarily operational. They're not there at the capacity they need to be. They are not well rested, and so as a consequence of that, of course, they're trying to recover from effectively a debilitating defeat, and that. When you're trying to recover, it takes time, and they have not been given that time to restore themselves, to replenish supplies and morale as well. So that's one of them. Another is the they've not been able to actually get the numbers of soldiers and munitions that are necessary for the scale of the renewed invasion in the Donbass. Of course, we think that part of the reason for that is this May the 9th deadline that Putin initially had to seeking to achieve numerous military successes that he could cite. I think it was interesting that he didn't really have much to say on the May 9th, which again speaks to the crisis within the Russian army. And lastly, something else that Phillips OBrien talks about is how the as bad as things are now, the longer term picture and the longer term miscalculation from the Russian perspective is that things are going to get a lot worse for them. That it seems to be that initially in the conflict they thought that their position would possibly strengthen as the Ukrainian perhaps will to resist would weaken as they sort of ground down in an attritional style conflict. The Ukrainian will to resist, but also the military capabilities of the Ukrainian state. But it would appear now actually the opposite has proven the case. We've spoken about the very, very high attrition rates that the Russian army has suffered, perhaps as high as 30% at its peak. And as a consequence of that, they just do not have the long-term capacity to continue fighting the war on the scale they were in those early weeks. And that is, I think, a reason why their progress has slowed down, as they are not able to take as many risks. They don't have the manpower to spare. They don't have the weapons to spare and the tanks, etc. So, yes, it's a very interesting piece, which I would recommend that people read, that just states where we are at this state in terms of the military miscalculations that have been made. And it would appear that really, as things stand, it's going to be very, very difficult for there to be any real way out for the Russian soldiers, that the picture is just going to get increasingly worse. And as a consequence of that, it's likely that they will have no choice but to bunker in and hope that at some point the Ukrainians will want to negotiate some sort of peace. But both based on the statements from Zelensky and the Western resolve and the increase in military support that's been provided to Ukraine, the higher level weaponry and everything else, I think that's highly unlikely. And so, I think it's going to be a longer war, but I think it's one that Russia is, unless there was very serious escalation on the nuclear front or some chemical warfare, that things are not going to go the way that the Russian state anticipated. And as I say, I hope that remains the case, because my God, if they do use chemical warfare or anything further than that, then I think that this conflict will become even more serious and one that we would certainly not like to see.
Thank you very much, Francis. Dom Nicholls, what do you make of that analysis?
Yeah, I've got no stones to throw at it whatsoever. I mean, Phillips OBrien, he knows his onions. I referred to him yesterday. It was his Twitter feed that put me onto that paper from the Centre for European Policy Analysis about whether or not the Russian military has always been a fairly hollow force, and that we have built ourselves against it, possibly unnecessarily, but maybe we've sort of partly created. I would say, I don't want to say created the problem, because that's leaning too close to Putin's narrative that it's NATO expansion and all the rest of it. I'm not trying to suggest that for one moment, but the paper that Phillips OBrien was referring to, and he did a Twitter thread on it, was just suggesting that maybe we'd built our systems and processes and organisations against a paper tiger, or against a force that actually now looks to have very credible nuclear weapons, and then not a lot else. And that's a very dangerous place to be. But yeah, a long-winded way of saying Phillips P. OBrien, one to follow on social media if you have the time, for regular and very, very concise and thought-provoking strategic and operational updates.
I should just add that also hoping to get him to write a piece in the coming days about thinking long term about the military lessons. Just speaking to Dom's point, that it will be, I think, when the conflict began, a lot of the initial talk was this shows the need for heavy infantry, heavy munitions, tanks, etc., artillery, increased investment in infantry numbers and everything else. Actually, will hopefully point out, many of the sort of lessons from this conflict has been on the virtue of advanced weaponry, and how that can actually completely demolish the Russian state's or a military aggressor's tank capacity, and of course drones as well. So there are other lessons rather than just, we need to expand our military forces, and I'm hoping that he'll be able to write on that soon, so watch this space. But just picking up on something else that Dom said, is Putin a paper tiger? Is Russia a paper tiger, etc.? Certainly from the perspective of Poland, that is not the case. And we did a piece in the newspaper yesterday, the physical newspaper, and it's also online, from the Polish Prime Minister, who argues very eloquently, actually, and very interestingly, that from his perspective, and from Poland's perspective, that Putin is actually more dangerous than Stalin and Hitler, which I know sounds a very extreme thing to say. But the reason that he articulates this is that, of course, Putin has nuclear weapons, which Hitler never had. And Stalin did have, but only very late, and there was never really at that point the capacity to use them in the same way that Putin has. The weapons were nowhere near as advanced, etc., etc. So there's that side, but he interprets the ideology as being much deadlier than that of Hitler and Stalin's, in the sense that the internet is at Putin's disposal, and he's able to infect, and this is his words, infect with millions of instances of fake news. And he says that this it will long-term pose a deadly threat to Europe, and it must be rooted out entirely. It's an interesting argument, as I say, and I think it's well worth reading and being paid serious attention to. After all, Poland have been, I would argue, perhaps had the most common sense approach to how to handle Putin in the long term, and have obviously been one of the most stoical supporters of Ukraine, and also in taking in refugees, etc. So I think, in a sense, history will look kindly on them and their attitudes towards Putin. But where I would perhaps challenge him is, I think, in the 1930s, when one looked at the ideologies of Nazism and communism, there was a real hunger for experimentation on political societies in that era, of course precipitated by the economic collapse that had taken place, sort of hyperinflation in Germany in 1923, but also the Wall Street crash of 1929, which really meant that people were challenging openly the democratic systems of Europe. And I remember Mark Brazow, the historian, wrote a fantastic book called Dark Continent, where his whole thesis really is that actually at various different points democracy was so fragile that you wouldn't have bet on democracy coming out of the 20th century as the victor. I don't think that we are in that state now. I think democracy and liberalism, for all of our scepticism about Fukuyama's theory about the end of history, still has life in it left, and we have, and there is that appreciation of it, certainly in the West and in Europe, that was not there in the 1930s. So I don't think in that regard that it is as serious as Nazism and communism were. But I think he is absolutely right to take Putin's threats very seriously, and of course the nuclear question is very, very relevant to this, and one that I think is absolutely right for him to draw attention to. So I'd urge listeners to give it a read, because, as I say, it offers a very interesting perspective on this.
Thank you very much, Francis. Before we go to both of your final thoughts, we've got a question from a listener asking if we know much about the POWs on both sides. You know, do we know how many Russian and Ukrainian troops are POWs? Do we know where they're being kept? What kind of information has been collected about them? And do we have a sense of how they're being treated? Dom and Francis, have we heard much about this? Can we say much?
No, I don't have those facts and figures to hand. I'm not going to try and bluff an answer now, but it's a really interesting area. I will dig into that, and we'll come back if not tomorrow, but in the very near future, because it deserves a more fleshed out and considered answer.
I would just say that I'd echo what Dom says. I think it's something that requires further research before we say more that could, in theory, be, or could potentially be wrong. But prisoners of war actually have a huge impact on conflicts in a way that I don't think is really appreciated. When we study things in relation to conflict, it always tends to be about the numbers of military resources, the number of infantry, etc., the great battles, the great figures, the great generals. We don't think about prisoners of war and the impact that these can have. But of course, when you've got numerous, potentially hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions in the case of the Second World War, of prisoners of war, this is it could be a major have a major impact on an economy. It can have a major impact on the amount of soldiers that are required to guard prisoners of war, etc. So it is relevant. And of course, atrocities committed against prisoners of war can also harden the resolve of a nation to resist an occupier or an aggressor, or vice versa. So again, that's significant. And I just flag one other interesting point on this in relation to the First World War. Niall Ferguson, in his book The Pity of War, which is his sort of analysis of the First World War, makes a very interesting argument about 1918. And it used to be the case, he argues, in the early stages of the war, so 1914 to 17, that the fear of the Germans was such that they didn't want to be captured by the British, or particularly by the French, because the fear was that they would be treated harshly, that they would eventually be executed, etc. And of course, the French had more reason to commit what I suppose we might say as war crimes, given the atrocities that were committed on their own soil and on Belgian soil. But as the war went on, the Allies sort of cottoned on that the way to achieve mass surrenders from a very low morale German army was to treat the prisoners of war very, very well. And this they did. And of course, when the spring offence of the 100 Days began at the end of the First World War, there were mass surrenders on the part of the German army when they realised that actually they would be treated better and they didn't have the resolve to fight anymore. The reason I mention this, not only thinking about it in the sort of geopolitical sense, is, of course, this has echoes of what Ukraine did in the very early stages of this conflict, when they essentially said, we're going to treat Russian soldiers well, we're going to let them call their mothers, and we're even going to let their mothers come and collect them from the border, because we don't blame some of these conscripts, we actually blame Putin. I think that's a very, very clever piece of, I suppose, means of justifying why, showing how you're different from your enemy and winning in this sort of information war around the world. But it may well, we don't know yet the extent to which this has filtered through to the Russian army. But if you imagine that you are facing a brutal command structure, one that really fetishizes the bullying of conscripts and recruits and hazing and all of this, if you're facing that and you're facing the Ukrainian resistance, which is far, far steeper, and you feel you've been lied to when you actually go on the ground, and you've not been well fed, your munitions are low, your morale is low, and you know you're going to be treated well by the Ukrainians, I think that the likelihood of surrender becomes very, very likely, and I think the Ukrainians have cottoned on to that. So we will look further into this, because it's a very, very interesting question.
Thank you, Francis. Well, thank you for your question, Bob. All I can say is keep on listening, and we'll get to it with some more detail for you. But thank you, Francis, for that. Well, can I get both of you? It's Wednesday afternoon. Can we get both of your thoughts on what we should be looking for in the next few days?
Yeah, for me, northeast, southwest. So northeast, Kharkiv. If Ukraine can still keep that toehold and push the Russians even further away outside of artillery range, it'll be a good thing. If they can push the Russians back to the border, that will be very significant. And if they can push them so far back that they're now interdicting the supply lines down from Belgorod down into the Donbass, that will be very, very significant. And in the southwest, Snake Island, for all the reasons that we said at the start of this space and this podcast, Snake Island in the hands of Russia is largely symbolic. Snake Island back in the hands of Ukraine poses a massive, massive headache for Russian forces in the northwest of the Black Sea, and probably discounts any significant military activity from the sea against Odessa.
My final thought is just based on a piece of analysis that I read from the Cold War historian Sergei Radchenko. He makes an interesting, I think, piece of analysis, which is just something that's going to be relevant in the weeks ahead, where he comments on how, in his view, there needs to be a complete Russian defeat. And he's not just talking about, he thinks one that needs to be sort of worse than actually what happened to Russia in 1991, when the narrative that was able to be picked up within the Russian state was that the USSR had folded under its own weight, that it in a sense had defeated itself. And that's why so many Russians wrongly accuse Gorbachev of treason. And it was, as I say, Putin was able to ride to power because he promised to deliver strength and to restore vitality to the Russian state that had been lost, and sort of to purge it of its traitors, etc., etc. But actually, if, in a sense, Russia is able to fail on its own terms, if the Putin regime can be shown to fail on its own terms, then this may well be, he argues, an opportunity for a real radical reevaluation within Russia, one that wakes up the Russian people to the fact that these lies, essentially, that they have been told since the 1990s were not true, and that the Russian state is actually much weaker and more diplomatically isolated, and that there needs to be an urgent change. In order for there to be a democratic state born, or at least a state that is not in the hands of men like Vladimir Putin, the public will have to find ways to wake up. And sometimes the only way in which people can wake up in a state like that is for it to fail on its own terms, just like communism, one could argue, did, and to some extent just as Nazism did. And so if we need to see a similar thing here, then I think that's something that we should be sensitive to when pondering the big question of where do we go long term in how we handle Russia. So I just thought an interesting piece of analysis, and one that I'm sure we will discuss again at some point.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Alice Hearing.